with the Russian troops defending the eastern front of Ukraine with heavy losses. The southern fronts became active. The intensity of clashes has increased in recent days, especially in Kherson, Melitopol, Tokmak, Zaporizhia, and the Crimea regions. But in these areas, the dominance of the airspace missile and drone attacks were much more prominent than trench warfare. Therefore, air defense systems were vital for victory on the southern front lines. The Russians have been seriously weakened in air defense since the beginning of the war. The Ukrainian forces, on the other hand, increased their missile attacks, taking advantage of the weakness of the Russian air defense on the southern front lines. An increasing number of explosions have been reported in occupied areas in southern Ukraine, such as Mariupol and Berdyansk. The damage it inflicted and the distance from the front pointed to the possibility of Ukrainian forces using new long-range Storm Shadow cruise missiles purchased from the United Kingdom. It turned out that a few days ago the Ukrainian armed forces attacked the Russian military base in Mariupol using Storm Shadow missiles. After this attack, the Ukrainians advanced along the land attack corridor extending to Crimea, and this time they targeted the port city of Berdyansk. Strong explosions were heard here. The target of the explosions was, again, the military facilities used by the Russian troops. Russian military warehouses allegedly located on the territory of the facility were attacked at around 3 p.m. On the day of the attack, a column of smoke rose into the sky at the site of the explosions. Russian officials claimed that these explosions were supposedly related to training and combat coordination. Only 24 hours after these statements, the Ukrainian armed forces again targeted Berdyansk with missiles. Recently, the Storm Shadow missile attacks by Ukrainian forces rekindled the panic atmosphere in Berdyansk. A Russian S-300 long-range surface-to-air missile system was hit after the explosion. The regional military administration reported, since the beginning of the war, the Ukrainian armed forces managed to destroy a total of 15 Russian S-300 air defense systems. With the destruction of the S-300 system in Berdyansk, this number increased to 16 Russian S-300 air defense systems destroyed by Ukrainian forces were usually stationed in Ukrainian cities such as Kherson, Zaporizhia, and Berdyansk. In addition, in the Kharkiv region, the Ukrainian forces managed to destroy the Russian S-300 air defense system. So what did it mean for Russia to lose 16 Siemens 300 air defense systems across Ukraine? The destruction of the S-300 defense systems with Storm Shadow missiles was an indication that Russian forces were no longer safe on Ukraine's southern front lines. Russian President Vladimir Putin was protecting the southern Ukrainian front lines, as far as Crimea, mostly with S-300 missile defense systems. However, with the Western military equipment provided to the Ukrainian army, the taboos containing the guarantees of the Russians were broken. In addition, these systems were sent back to the manufacturers due to some technical problems in the past months. Russian officials claimed that this problem was not so important and that there was no problem in air defense on Ukrainian soil. However, with the destruction of another S-300 system in the latest attack by Ukrainian forces in Berdyansk, the minor problem that Russia considered as insignificant has apparently continued. On the other hand, the offensive operation of the Ukrainian forces in Berdyansk greatly affected the residents of the region. The negative situations and offensive operations in the city seriously frightened the Russian troops and their relatives there. The Russians no longer felt safe here and were evacuating their families and property. They wanted to flee, but the Russian security forces were preventing many from escaping the area. In the settlements of the Berdyansk region, the food supply and daily necessities are scarce. For this reason, Russian troops and their relatives were in revolt. While the attacks continued to worry Russian soldiers and their relatives, they also gave hope to the Ukrainian civilians in the region. Russia's deficits in air defense not only forced the residents of the region to evacuate, but also made the Russian troops in cities such as Berdyansk and Zaporizhia despair. most of the Russian soldiers in Zaporizhia have now been fighting without being returned from the front lines, not counting the occasional quick trip home to see their families. Although the worn-out Russian forces tried to occupy the southern front lines of Ukraine, the Ukrainian armed forces aims to completely clear Zaporizhia and Berdyansk from the Russians by using its dominance area in Kherson. The offensive plans of the Ukrainian army are taking shape on all the southern front lines. In fact, Ukraine has a lot to do. Months of preparation, premium tanks and armored vehicles, Western jammer and mine clearance equipment, and the precision strike capabilities of the HIMARS and M270 systems will be crucial to success in the offensive. Ukraine will also try to make the most of Western intelligence assistance and stockpile ample artillery for the attack. This will determine the direction and duration of the Ukrainian offensive axis. In addition, 16s allocated by the USA and MiG fighters sent by Poland to Ukraine are among the elements that will strengthen the air dominance of the Ukrainian armed forces. Russia also built numerous minefields, Dragon's Teeth, anti-vehicle trenches, and trench lines on the southern front lines to prepare for attacks on Ukraine. Especially these defensive fortifications are also seen in the Crimean Peninsula. But the Ukrainians say that sooner or later they will liberate all Ukrainian lands, including the Crimea, as leader Zelensky put it. The success of an attack is directly proportional to the value of the targeted area in person. The destruction of military bases, ammunition depots, military convoys and supply routes, and the killing of senior commanders are very important in this respect. Since the beginning of the war, the Ukrainian army has been targeting senior commanders of the Russian army and important military sites and has carried out many successful attacks against the invaders. The Ukrainian army's attacks targeting strategic points belonging to the occupying Russian army caused the Russian army to be exhausted. Recently, there has been a new development that will accelerate the depletion of the Russian army. The perpetrator was, of course, the Ukrainian army, which is getting stronger day by day. In the first few days of February, the Ukrainian army hit the Druzhba oil pipeline, one of the most important sources of income for the Russian invaders. The hitting of this oil pipeline could cause Russia a huge economic problem in the long run because this pipeline, which was the target of the missiles, was transporting more than 33 million tons of oil per hour from Europe to many countries. Moreover, the Druzhba oil pipeline was one of the longest oil pipeline systems in the world. The Druzhba oil pipeline, located in Bryansk region, generated billions of dollars in revenue for Russia. The Ukrainian army's targeting of this important source of income represents a major strategic success. At first glance, Ukraine's attack seemed to harm the European countries, which have always come to the fore with their support and assistance to the Ukrainian army. But there was a much more important development underlying this attack. Since the beginning of the Russian-Ukrainian war, the European Union has been working to reduce its dependence on Russia for natural gas and oil. Over the course of a year, the EU has carried out a series of studies on this issue. As a result of these efforts, dependence on Russia for natural gas and oil has been significantly reduced. A year ago, the EU imported 40% of the gas used in European countries from Russia, while today this number has dropped to 15%. The EU and the UK are gradually reducing their dependence on Russia for gas and oil through various projects. Russia was able to resist the sanctions imposed by Western and European countries thanks to the natural gas and oil revenues it exported to many countries around the world. Putin's biggest weapon was not the tanks, cannons and rifles in the Russian army, but the oil and natural gas lines running under the ground and under the sea. While the increasing loss of the soldiers and diminishing ammunition in the occupied territories has pushed the Russian army into a corner, the targeting of Russia's largest oil pipeline by Ukrainian missiles seems to prepare the end of Putin. The explosion of the oil pipeline targeted by Ukrainian missiles was not the first oil pipeline explosion in Russia. There have been many oil pipeline explosions in Russia. The explosions in November and December raised questions in mind because it was claimed that these explosions in Russia were made by the Russians. Russia was allegedly threatening Europe with these explosions. These allegations remained as allegations. But what is clearer than allegations is that the Russian occupiers no longer have the power to threaten anyone. Putin, who relied on the natural gas, oil reserves, and pipeline systems on Russian soil, lost his biggest weapon when the world states started to build alternative pipelines to the occupying Russia. Having lost one of the largest oil pipeline systems with the largest operation, Putin is also experiencing a major setback on the front line. As the Russia-Ukraine war completes its first year, the course of the war is increasingly in Ukraine's favor. Developments in eastern and southern Ukraine clearly show that the Russian army is exhausted in the face of strategic attacks by the Ukrainian army, such as the hitting of the Druzhba oil pipeline. The Russian army is carrying out senseless attacks of no importance. The inexperience of the Russian army is clearly evident in the clashes in the occupied territories. Moreover, the Russian army does not give up on these failed and ineffective attacks. Former Russian intelligence officer Igor Girkin made a statement about the failed attacks of the Russian army in recent months. Girkin described the Russian army's refusal to give up unsuccessful tactics and operations despite repeated attempts as stupid stubbornness. The inexperience of the Russian invaders was once again demonstrated in the video posted the other day by Ukrainian officer Anatoly Typhon, in which Russian soldiers are in a damaged area as open targets. The Ukrainian army rewarded this mistake of the Russian soldiers with a successful missile attack. The development that is the subject of the video took place in eastern Ukraine. The footage shows about 10 Russian soldiers moving on foot in an open area. A few Russian soldiers are wounded and other soldiers have difficulty carrying the wounded Russian soldiers. And these images are recorded from the air as the Ukrainian army starts the operation. A few of the soldiers in the footage are killed with the first missile shot. Then, as other soldiers in the area come nearer to the soldiers targeted by the missiles, several more missiles are fired as a result of this attack. It is seen that all the soldiers in the footage were blown up. After the publication of the footage of the attack, the weapon used in the attack became a subject of debate. The fact that the footage was recorded from the air gave rise to the idea that the attack was carried out by Bayraktar TB2 drones. However, it is widely believed that the weapons used in the attack was the Ukrainian-made anti-tank missile NAPI or ATM. In the comments on the images shared on social media, it was stated that shooting a soldier with an anti-tank missile was a great success because it is very difficult to hit small targets with these missiles. The user on social media commented under the attack post as follows: "Whoever fired those 3 shots is undoubtedly the best ATM operator in the world. He is officially sniping with it." The Ukrainian army continues to make great history against the Russian invaders. The Russian army's military personnel losses, including the losses in the latest video, total about 130,000. Russia has also lost hundreds of thousands of tons of ammunition, oil, and gas pipelines. The only and most trusted resource of Russian leader Vladimir Putin continued to be the target of the Ukrainian army. Ukrainian forces published the losses of the Russian invaders on February 2nd. The losses of the Russian army from the beginning of the occupation until February 2nd are as follows: 129,030 military personnel, 3,211 tanks, 6,382 armored combat vehicles, 2,212 artillery systems, 458, reactive volley fire systems, 222, air defense systems, 293, aircraft, 284 helicopters, 5,064 tanks and automotive equipment, 18 military ships and boats, 796 cruise missiles, 1951 drones, 200 special machines, and 4 operational tactile missile complexes. It seems very difficult for Russia to continue the war with these losses. So what are your thoughts? Do you think the Russian army can continue the war with increasing losses? Will the Ukrainian army's attacks on the Russian oil and gas pipelines affect the Russian economy? What do you think about the course of the war? There is a lot of news from the Donetsk region. One of the reasons why there was so little movement in this region is that there are a lot of rivers and lakes that create natural obstacles. However, 2 weeks of freezing temperatures covered the waters with ice, creating new opportunities for offensive actions. There are 3 main directions: Avdiivka, Mariinka, and Volodar. The most important developments happened today in the Avdiivka region. Here, the main goal of the Russians is to push the Ukrainians from Avdiivka by any means. Avdiivka is one of the closest Ukrainian positions to Donetsk and Makiivka, which creates enormous problems for the Russians. For example, if you still remember, right before the new year, the Ukrainians destroyed a huge Russian base in Makiivka, killing approximately 600 mobilized soldiers that were about to be sent to the front. Of course, HIMARS would be able to strike this base regardless of who controls Avdiivka. But identifying this base and constantly monitoring the ground with UAVs would be much more difficult without such a valuable toehold. So having this stronghold right on the porch of the biggest cities in Donbass gives the Ukrainians a huge tactical advantage. Unfortunately for the Russians, storming Avdiivka in front like Bakhmut will not work at all, because if we zoom in and switch to satellite view, we can see that there are a lot of lakes, bridges, and tree belts. And if you look at the topographic map, we can see that Ukrainian and Russian positions are separated by the lowlands. For all these reasons, the only viable option remained to take Avdiivka into a pocket, which they started doing by storming Vojny. However, the Russians faced a huge problem. The natural barrier in the form of a river did not allow them to breach the Ukrainian defense, and they got stuck. There was a series of attacks and counterattacks in this region, which resulted in no change in the situation. But the weather conditions changed everything. For the last 2 weeks, the temperature has been below zero, meaning that the water has frozen and created a natural bridge between the northern and southern parts of Vojny. Over the last several days, the temperatures once again started to increase, and from tomorrow they are expected to turn positive. So the window of opportunity to start storming Ukrainian positions from mice started to close. That is why today the Russians launched an attack on the eastern outskirts. The first group purportedly established a toehold, and the fights broke out as attention shifted and the operation developed. The Russians started sending reinforcements, which the Ukrainians tried to counter from the central part and stop them right on the ice. Unfortunately, the frozen water changed the setting and turned the least viable direction for the Russians into the most viable. The latest news suggests that the Russians have established control over the eastern part of Vojny, but the fights are by no means over. The Ukrainians can support their units in Virginia easily. Unlike the Russians, the Ukrainians will likely try to prolong the battle until the above-zero temperatures return and eliminate the possibility of supplying Russian groups over the ice. On top of that, some Russian sources raised the alarm that the whole offensive operation is in danger because the last batches of artillery and mortar shells received in Spartak, Pervomaisk, and Vojny are bad and cannot be used when it comes to the Mariinka area. Last time I told you that the Ukrainians had to step back a few blocks in order to avoid the crossfire. The Russians managed to establish control over this triangle in the northern part of the village, which opened access to direct fire control over the avenue crossing. It became incredibly dangerous, which is why the fight shifted a little bit to the west. From that point, the front line stabilized and the intensity of the fights decreased. But everything changed today. A lot of sources report intense artillery preparation. Ukrainian formations are still standing their ground, although looking at Mariinka, it seems like almost every square meter has been shelled and destroyed. Nonetheless, the Ukrainians are anticipating an attack and have already reinforced Ukrainian Marines that are holding the defense with a dozen armored vehicles to meet the attackers. Other units in the region are expecting a new batch of drones. Lastly, when it comes to the Volodar area here, the Russians have been conducting a number of combat reconnaissance attacks. The Ukrainians are also reportedly actively gathering reconnaissance by using drones. The main goal of both parties here is to be fully aware of all developments behind the scenes and be ready for an attack at any time. Overall, despite a lot of interesting developments, the fights remain largely positional, according to many Russian sources. The reason why they are constantly attacking this extremely well-fortified positions is not to breach them. Russian command does not expect any breakthroughs here. The reason why they are constantly attacking is to preserve the initiative. But as long as the Ukrainian defense stands and the Russians cannot build their bases in Donetsk and Makiivka, Russian actions do not harm Ukrainian operational goals.